Hey guys, people are straying here. So I've been doing some reflecting, and I thought I would just share some interesting thoughts on the topic. And this isn't a counter apologetic or anything. I'm not really trying to make a point here. It's just an interesting observation I had. So the topic is Mormonism versus Christianity, and really the sort of the highest ideal of each religion. And of course, I'm being pretty general with Christianity because, of course, there's all sorts of different Christianities, but I think you know what I mean. So with Mormonism, I think the highest ideal is family. Everything's about family. Even, God and our relation to him is a familial relationship. He's our heavenly father, and it's not just metaphorical or whatever. Mormonism is all about family. And this applies to heaven. When you hear Mormons talk about heaven, you'll hear them very often talk about the eternal family, how meaningful it is to them to have that promise, how much they look forward to spending eternity with their families. And of course, that's very relatable. That's very understandable. I think that's something that would motivate most people, at least most people who have healthy, happy family relationships. And this is very different from Christianity's highest ideal, which I would say is God. And again, this isn't a counter apologetic. I'm not saying that Mormons don't love God or anything like that. But so when I talk about it being God being the highest ideal in Christianity, it's you hear them talk about heaven, and they don't really talk about their families. I mean, Christians don't even believe that marriage persists into heaven. There's that famous Bible verse. I think it's Matthew 22:30. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And there's no expectation in Christianity for marriage to continue. I don't know exactly how they feel about like family relationships, but when they talk about heaven, it's about sort of like that eternal joy, rapturous union with God, just spending eternity basking in the presence of God. And honestly, I feel like that's less relatable than sort of the Mormon ideal. And of course, that also exists in Mormonism. That's not like, it's not like that isn't a promise of the scriptures, but I think if you just kind of listen to what people talk about and even what the prophets and apostles talk about, I think it's very clear that that promise of an eternal family is at least as equal of a valued promise as the idea of spending eternity with God. And of course, it makes sense. You look at the tradition in the Bible, or the Christian tradition. There's a long tradition of Hermeticism and sort of like that ideal of being like that that ascetic who has no family but lives in a monastery or lives in a desert and just worships God all day. It's a very high ideal, especially in Catholicism. Protestantism doesn't quite as much idealize that. And and of course there's verses in the Bible that allude to that. Paul very much said things like that. For example, 1 Corinthians 7, verses 8 through 9. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single, as I am. But if they cannot exercise self control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So there's a clear difference there. In Mormonism, you cannot be exalted without that eternal family, without, your spouse. There's a quote by an apostle, I don't remember which one, that said salvation is a singular effort or an individual thing, but exaltation, excuse me, exaltation is a family affair, and that's very much a Mormon belief. And of course, exaltation is the highest eternal reward in Mormonism. And it's maybe a bit subtle, but it's a distinct clash in what is the highest ideal. Because Christianity, if you just read what's actually in the Bible, it's pretty clear that marriage and family life is not necessarily the highest ideal. That uh, sort of that singular life devoted to God, like Paul talked about, that is the highest ideal, at least according to Paul. Perhaps you might say that That isn't necessarily the ideal that Jesus taught in his ministry, but at the very least, it's clearly a very strong ideal of Paul. And, an observation I had, which, this isn't meant to be a counter apologetic, but it could be taken this way, is, in the Doctrine and Covenants, in section 76, the, section 76 doesn't actually talk about eternal families. Which is kind of a curious thing to note. But anyway, so if you look in 76, talking about the degrees of glory. So the second highest degree, the terrestrial kingdom, it mentions that if you're in this kingdom, you have the presence of Jesus, and that's I think that's verse 77 that you can look that up in section 76. Or yeah, you have the presence of Jesus but not the Father. But of course, it's also Mormon belief that if to have that eternal family, that eternal marriage, you know, that's that's the highest reward of the celestial kingdom. So it's an interesting thing to note that spending eternity with Jesus is a lower reward than having an eternal family and an eternal marriage. And of course, eternal families, eternal marriages, that's wrapped up in exaltation and becoming a god. So, it's not quite as simple as that sounds, but it's an interesting observation. And it's not meant to be a counter apologetic, but it's curious. It's curious that that eternal family is a higher reward than spending eternity with Jesus. But I'm not a Christian. I'm not a Mormon. I'm not making this to diss anyone. I think personally that the Mormon ideal is much more relatable for most people. I don't think most people, really want to spend eternity in a rapturous union with God, praising Him and worshiping His incredibleness. I think that doesn't really appeal to most of us, honestly, if we're being honest. Whereas, spending eternity with our family, and of course, spending eternity with our spouse, as long as we have a healthy, happy family relationship and we actually like our spouse, that sounds pretty nice. So, I don't know. Maybe Christians would say that that's an inferior ultimate ideal and that God should be the only ideal, but I don't know. I think whether people want to admit it or not, I think more people would relate to the Mormon ideal. But yeah, let me know what you think. This was just an observation I had, and of course, please let me know, Mormons, if I misrepresented anything. It's not my intention for this to be, an attack video or anything like that. It's genuinely not. So yeah, thank you for watching and have a good one. Goodbye.